Welcome back, everyone. Over the course of the next two videos here, we're going to be exploring a couple of the erosion tools when working with our landscapes. And in preparation for these videos, I went ahead and I sculpted some blobby mountains on here, and then I did some very quick sculpting with each of these two erosion tools, just to give you a quick sneak peek as to the kinds of looks that we can achieve. So from this angle, I just used my sculpting tool to create some blobby mountains. They don't look too exciting or realistic. If I use my level hotkey here, I'm going to fly around to the other side of my mountain range here. This is the kind of look that you can achieve using the erosion tool, at least on a mountainside of sorts. And if I fly around to the other side up high, this is a sort of look that you can achieve when using the hydro erosion tool. So that's what's in store for the next two videos. I'm going to pause the video here, and when we come back, we're going to explore just the erosion tool. And we are back. A simple blobby mountain range to get us started here. Let's explore the erosion tool. And of course, we need to be in landscape mode. And in landscape mode, you got to make sure you got that sculpt tab selected. And then over on the left-hand side, make sure you've got our erosion tool selected. Now, just a quick tip here. It does have tool tips for every tool that you hover your mouse over. This says that this is thermal erosion, simulates erosion moved from higher to lower areas. And if you hold down the Control plus Alt keys, it'll give you a little preview there as to the kind of effect that can be achieved. And we saw that similar kind of carved rock effect over on that right-hand picture there just a moment ago. So make sure you got your erosion tool selected. And I'm just going to change my brush size back to its default. Now let's start exploring some of our tool settings over here, and we're going to start with the most obvious one, being the tool strength. Actually, let me just jack up my brush size here to be a little bit more. Tool strength, pretty self-explanatory. If you have a big number, let's crank it all the way up, and then you left click, you're going to see a pretty dramatic effect for any tool that you use. Let me do Control Z to undo that. Whereas if I have this down to a much lower value, you get much less of an effect. Really controls how quickly the effect is applied. I'm going to hit Control Z again to undo that. Control Y, as a reminder, is how you can redo that, but I'm going to set it back like this for the time being. Let's go back to a default tool strength. Combined layers operation. Again, this matters if you have multiple layers that you have in your stack of editable layers. I only have one right now, so that this is not going to come into play. Let's talk about threshold next. Threshold. The minimum height difference necessary for the erosion effects to be applied. So smaller values will result in more erosion being applied. So if I set this to a value of, say, 1, you're going to see a rather dramatic effect here by left clicking and just kind of rubbing this across the top of our mountain range. Pretty much flattens it straight away. Control Z, I'm going to undo that. Whereas if I crank this all the way up to 128, now I'm going to get a steep kind of slope. So essentially, the bigger the number, the steeper the slope that you're going to be carving into what it is you're trying to erode. Let me do Control Z right there, and you saw how steep that slope was. A value of like 64, which is about halfway in between. It's not going to be quite as sharp of a slope as it was with 128. Now you can see, as I am sculpting this a little bit, you're seeing these like little bit of jitter right there. Right there. That results from this parameter right here known as noise scale. So let me just do Control Z really quickly on that. Let's explore noise scale while that is taking up our attention. If we jack this all the way down and I left click and apply this all around, you can see how it applies that sort of jitter, some noise to wherever I sculpt. Control Z to undo. Whereas if I have this cranked all the way up, that effect is greatly minimized. So if you want to add a little noise, you need to make the value smaller. That's kind of unintuitive and it confuses a lot of people, but that's what you got to do. That's how it works. Next one we're going to explore here is, let me flip over my page of notes. is our noise mode. Currently, by default, it is set to lower. So it says it only applies erosion effects that result in lowering the height map. So it only transfers soil lower. However, you can change this to be both or raise. So let me just change my noise scale back to its default there. And let's explore this by coming over to the side of a mountain right about here. Change my brush size to about there. And I'm just going to kind of rub along the edge of this mountain range here. So with it lower, you can see it's transferring it from high points on down the mountain. Going to Control Z right there. Next, let's go raise. Now you can see how as I try to rub over it, it is trying to raise it up in areas. Now obviously it's easier for soil to go downhill than uphill, but you can see it's making some attempts to raise it up in areas. Let's do Control Z right there. And if I do both, you kind of get a little bit of each. That's kind of the happy medium in between there. Now, something you're going to notice here is that this erosion tool, it's really great for kind of sculpting the ridge line of a mountain range, like so. Because when you're just sculpting, you see some kind of blobby, rounded top mountains, and that doesn't look very realistic. The erosion tool is great for crafting that kind of finely tuned ridge of a mountain range. Let's do Control Z one more time to set us back to our default. You know, actually, before I move on here, I wanted to show you how to create some protruding rocks kind of look in the side of your mountain here. If you change your noise mode to raise and we increase our tool strength quite a lot here, what you can do is as you're rubbing this along the side of a mountain, never mind the noise here, let's just keep rubbing kind of in the midpoint here. You can eventually raise up sort of another mountainous ridge line. So you can see we've kind of got this mountain range in the background, that ridge line right there, and now we're having a slab of protruding rock starting to stick out from here. And if I kind of fly up, you can see how we're starting to craft another little ridge line. Many mountain ranges kind of have that slabs of protruding rock like so. Let me do Control Z once and twice to set me back to where I was. Next, let's explore this parameter called iterations. So iterations is kind of like tool strength in a way. The lower the number, the lower the strength of the number of iterations, of thermal iterations you're going to be performing. So let's crank this all the way down. And if I'm rubbing it across my ridgeline, you see it has a very minimal effect, and it doesn't really transfer that much ground from one area to another. However, if I Control Z and crank this all the way up and rub this along the top, it does do more, but not all that much. Now if I do Control plus Z here to set me back, and I'm going to set my iterations back, and I'm going to set my tool strength all the way up. Tool strength is a little bit more heavy-handed than iterations when it comes to the transferring of soil from one area to the other. So I kind of like to think of iterations as a sort of mini modifier when transferring soil from one area to the next. I'm going to set my tool strength back, and next let's talk about our surface thickness parameter. Now this one is great for making your mountain range kind of pop out or sink in areas as well. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to change a few parameters here. I'm going to jack up my surface thickness all the way. I'm going to jack up my tool strength all the way. Iterations, let's jack that up to 150 as well. Sure, why not? Noise scale, let's bring that up to something like 90 is probably good. Don't want too much jitter there. In our noise mode, let's set this to raise. Now when I rub this along the side of my mountain range here, you will see kind of bringing on a slab of protruding rock. Kind of like we were doing before. Again, you can tweak and tune a lot of the levers here, your different tool settings to achieve varying results. Sometimes they're similar, sometimes they're different. Okay, I'm gonna do, let me just fly around here. You can see how that kind of brought up some protruding rock there. Gonna do Control Z again. Now, if I was to change my noise mode from raise to lower with all the rest of these settings being the same, now watch what happens when I rub in the side of a mountain. It kind of is sinking that portion of the mountain in. All right, let's do Control Z from there as well. All right, so let's put all of this together and try to come up with a decent looking mountain range. So I'm going to set all of my parameters here back to default because we've just explored some of the parameters here. I like to usually go with a noise mode of both. Threshold, I usually like to go about 75-ish. And I usually like to start off by kind of rubbing along the mountain range. The mountain range lip, if you will. Let me increase my brush size quite substantially as well. I usually go pretty large right from the get-go. So I kind of like to rub kind of along the side like that. You can see how it's defining the ridgeline quite dramatically, which I think looks kind of nice. I am getting quite a lot of jitter there with our noise scale. We can smooth that out over time. Let me just bring that on up. Rub. And the best part of the erosion tool, I find, is just creating sharp looks to all of your initial sculpting blobs. Now, you got a lot of these streaks when you're starting out here, and that's okay. We can smooth a lot of those streaks out with some of the other tools, and with our next tool, the Erosion Tool, we can further kind of carve out areas of our land as well. Make it look like rainwater flew into it. Let's change noise mode now to raise. I'll crank up my surface thickness here. Noise scale, let's set that to, say, 90. Going to change my brush size down to, say, 5,000, and I'm going to crank up my tool strength. And let me change my threshold. I want a little bit of a steeper incline, so I'm going to crank that up as well. And I'm going to be looking to make a little bit of a protruding slab right here. That's a little bit heavy-handed. Change my brush size a little bit lower. And you can see how you can have kind of a slab within a slab, which I think kind of creates a nice look from time to time. All right, a lot more I could play with here, but that's just the rough general gist of using the erosion tool to better sculpt your landscape. I recommend using it to take the smoothness, the unnaturalness out of your initial sculpting. It's going to make a mountain range look a lot better with just a few changes here and there. That's going to do it all for this one. We will see you guys in the next one where we explore the Erosion Tool. See you there.